concept picture that my project falls under, and then through that my design approach. Then I'll take you through the mapping on the different levels, the different scales, the macro, meso, and micro. Then zooming in on my focus site. And then I will take you through the process and then the product eventually of my focus site. And then so my site is located, the municipality of Bachelors is located at its epicenter around 5 kilometers from the coast. And basically you can see its location in terms of Ontinyes. There's a valley that runs down the middle of the municipality, and it's one of the secondary valleys of the Ontinyes River. So I'd just like to start with this map, which shows the desertification in the Mediterranean. And marked in red is Lebanon. And we basically fall into a serious to moderate vulnerability in terms of desertification. So I started here where I saw this map, and I thought, on a larger scale, we have some ecological issues that are taking place and that link directly to this kind of regional scale. So basically, to put it very briefly, we are observing in Lebanon a lot of environmental issues: climate change, pollutants, habitat loss, species loss, and all these interconnect to each other, and they also interconnect directly to societal problems, economic problems, political problems, soil degradation, and they are basically a threat to our well-being and our longevity as an ongoing society. So there's this ecological breakdown. Zooming in on the valley here, you can see in red all the highly degraded and urbanized zones. And in the center of the valley, you can see the dark green areas are relatively intact woodland. And basically, there's a lot of encroachment coming in with new developments all around. So I started here, and I started focusing on the municipality, and I realized there are 2 large schools on the edge of the valley. And I thought the best way to solve a problem is to prevent it in the first place, from the cause. So I located the 3 different schools in the municipality. 2 of them, St. Joseph's School and Jesus and Mary, are located on the edge of the valley, and they've been there for over 100 years. And basically, I decided that my main project would focus on these schools, to focus on the students, to make sure that they understand the importance of the environment. And basically, the investment goes into ecologically sensitizing them and making them stewards of the land. So zooming back out to the large scale, this kind of shows the landform. The gist of it is basically that this is the watershed, this is one ridge line, that's the second one, and there's a seasonal river that runs down the middle. Also on a large scale, I mapped out all the different building uses and the accessibility in the private plots. The municipality is mainly privately owned. The entire valley is privately owned, which is kind of haunting because anyone can come in and build a building and basically destroy the ecological value that it has. And it's highly residential, and there's a lot of new developments. So you can see here, there's a lot of encroachment that's taking place down into the center of the valley. You can see here the bridge at the top. This is one of the schools and one of the old towns that's at the top of the ridge. And you can see the valley just comes, the woodland just comes right up to the top, and already you can see signs of degradation. So zooming back in, I eventually picked St. Joseph's School. I'm a graduate there, and I know the area very well. And around it, there's a lot of interesting elements that take place. Namely, there's 3 large main contexts that the school is in the center of. You have the modern residences, which is basically the suburban area, the expansion outside of Beirut.
Take those ones. Okay, try the slides, George.
Oh, okay. And then you have the old traditional town, which is mainly agricultural. And it's a mosaic of different buildings that interconnect with each other. And it's a very well-knit religious community. But also what's interesting is you have a lot of abandoned buildings. So there's a shift from the old towns to the more modern residences that I saw before. And then you have the valley, which is very valuable in its ecology, and it's used by the public. You have different walkways that the municipality has formed inside of it so that people can actually have a place where they can go and walk. It's called the Boulevard. So the school itself, this is a school. It's very, very large, and it's mainly hardscape, in fact. The school is surrounded by greenery, but in the center, it's just been built up over time. It's also the center for the Maronite Archbishopric, which you can see here. and has a very large student body. And it was founded in 1963, so it's pretty, the space is related to the school. You can see the largest ones are on the periphery. And I figured out what would be the most valuable spot that I could actually be on. And the concept was to bring the students out and to create spaces for the students to learn with, learn in, so that they can understand their position in the larger context. So I zoned in on 3 different sites: an abandoned house, which actually the school has in the old, an abandoned quarry, which is highly degraded, and then the valley side. And I basically went through and kind of formed a curriculum or a syllabus for each of these sites. What would the students be able to learn, and what would the program be? What are the pros and cons? And eventually, I picked this site in the center, because in a second I'll tell you why. But you can see here just some site photos. It's an abandoned quarry. In the center you can see the base of the quarry. There's some bedrock that's exposed. A lot of rubble. There's an old historical well that used to be used but is currently not used. And it's basically highly degraded and kind of in succession. You can see here in orange and cream color the school's property, surrounded by residential buildings. Everything in gray is private, and all the white is residential. So it's surrounded by all these residential buildings. The site vegetation is basically almost barren in a sense that it's just grasses, and it's just a succession of grasses. And there's very few trees, except for one orchard that's managed on the right with old terraces. And then there's a lot of rubble, which is not down here in small. It's a bit hard to see. So the reason I picked this site is because of its relationship to those 3 larger contexts that I spoke about. It is the only site out of the 3 that is directly linked to those 3 contexts. There's an intersection that leads directly to the residences, one that directly leads to the valley, and another to the old town. And here I'm talking about the connectivity with the school. Since it is surrounded by residential buildings, there's very specific spots that I can actually access it to the school, I can connect it with the school with. So this is very important with formal design. So going back to my concept and the fact that I'm bringing the students out and teaching them about the environment and their position in it. This kind of schematic shows that there are 3 main elements that I focus on the site. There's the sun and the water, the climate. They're the sources of life, basically. The ecosystems, which major in trees. And then the people who learn, design, then appreciate, and then protect. And the framework, my theoretical framework, starts with immersing the students in these environments that I'm creating through a classroom or through a park. And basically, the result is biosocial. So human consciousness changes, people's perceptions change, and also the ecology gets regenerated. So this barren site, which was once a quarry, turns into a forest. And then the longevity of both the ecology and the humans persists. So here, you can see some landform. It's pretty steep. There's around a 20-meter drop. And what I did is I did a slope analysis. So these dark areas are very steep, and these light areas are relatively shallower. So my main concern was actually rehydrating the landscape. So by rehydrating it, by inserting this water element, I'm able to usher in new ecosystems and enhance the complexity of the ecosystems. So I use a system of swales. So I inserted these swales along contour along the site, and I even put in certain key pond areas, which are very ideal. And both the slope and the swales determine where my trees go. So along the bottom of the downslope side of the swale, you plant trees to stabilize the soil. And along the steepest slopes, you plant trees to stabilize the soil and reduce erosion. And once you overlay these two, you start getting space. I started getting basically different spaces that I could work with and different places that I can insert my program into. So these elements are both considering the water and the climate and also the ecosystems. But what's left are the people. So what I did, how to determine, because it's a pretty large site, it's around 12,000 meters squared. So I wanted to figure out where is the center of activity, and what activities happen on the edges, and how do they all relate to each other. So I used a system of zones, where the core zone is the highest activity zone, and zone 1 through 5 decrease in daily maintenance. So whatever programs that I need to include, whatever needs a daily amount of attention and activity goes in the center, and everything that needs the least amount of maintenance and activity goes to the edges. So here you can see the zones on my site. My zone 1 is around this area, and my zone 2, 3, 4, 5 basically go out on the edges, and the entire area is buffered to the edges with trees. I'm going to show you the actual plan in a second, but the main thing is I have in the center an educational greenhouse, which becomes the outdoor classroom for the students. Around there are vegetable gardens to teach the students the different elements of self-sufficiency, economy, water saving, different elements like that. I have crop gardens, orchards, and then I have a succession of classrooms. I have a meadow classroom, a shrubland classroom, and a forest classroom. So I'm showing them ecologically the succession of classrooms, succession of ecosystems, and teaching them in each of these what happens, what are the dynamics of the spaces. And also one thing, I have a parking, which is actually one of the requirements that the school wanted. They plan on making a parking along this entire thing, and I thought, wait, hold up a second, there's a better way to do this. So I made sure to include a parking into this. So I did a parking study to make sure that I minimize the parking space and maximize the park space. So this is the final plan. You can see tree line swale, and trees all along the buffers. The main central zone is here where there's a greenhouse, and then there's one large circulation corridor that runs along the site. In the center of it is a large landmark tree, where basically this is public domain actually. So I made sure that the public domain was used as circulation, so it functions for both the community and also the school, and it becomes a community space. And around it, I have different playgrounds for the community. I have my ponds, and I have my different succession of spaces, my meadow garden, my shrubland garden, and the highly treed area here is the forest garden. This is the existing orchard along the terraces, which is expanded slightly. And along the terraces, I have crop gardens where there are no trees. And one thing you see here is actually a biophilic inspired parking. This is the parking building. And along the top of the building, I put a rooftop garden. So the rooftop garden complements the rest of the site. And the reason for the shape, I'll explain in a second. So these are the sections. This section runs along here through the terraces. So you can see there's a very steep area which is planted with trees to stabilize the soil. Then you have your terraces and then your meadow garden, a meadow classroom. And then this one, you can see the different swales that I put in here. And the swales basically collect all the runoff and infiltrate it into the soil, which allows the trees to grow. So this is the plan, and then the last section goes here through the pond. And you can see the pond is large here, and there's different pathways that run along it, and then parking in the background of the roof garden. So the roof garden itself, let me explain. The site has a lot of old terraces, and there's a lot of cyclamen that grows in the terraces. And I was inspired by it because I realized the resilience that the cyclamen has to grow through these very hard surfaces. And I thought it'd be very symbolic if the shape of the roof symbolized the cyclamen. So it's basically a large garden growing on a rock, which is the building, just like the cyclamen grows on rocks. So, and also, so here I'm explaining different pieces of the park. You have an educational park, which is outdoor oriented. You have different exhibits, ant exhibits, animal-inspired play sets, sand beds. This explains the keyhole garden concept. If you go back to my plan, you can see I have very peculiar shapes here. It's a certain system of vegetable gardens which saves space, and this explains how it is. And then my orchard is enhanced. Originally, the orchard is a polyculture, it has many different species, but what I've done is I've layered it with different plants to make it more diverse. So this is how the swales work. They basically contribute the swales to the water. And to end with, I have two scenes here. This is basically a scene that is in this area here. And this is the valley, and this is a very diverse system. Think about it, it's private, and anyone can come in and build something like this. So it's our choice at the end. So what my project strives to do is rekindle the people's connection with these kinds of places, so that we can avoid creating situations like this. So I'd like to end with a quote. Every child is born a naturalist. His eyes are by nature open to the glories of the stars, the beauty of the flowers, and the mystery of life. And my project strives to do just that. Thank you. Questions, comments, observations?
I'll just ask the first question. Can you come back to your plan? Because I think in the beginning you talked to us a lot about the process, and I think it seems like a very, very interesting process. and that you had a reason behind everything you've done, especially with saying like starting with this way and kind of where you located your trees and things like that. Can you remind us a bit about this process in your plan, throughout your plan, so we can link the process to the product?
So the product itself doesn't reveal it because it all acts as one system. But let me show you. The steepest areas of these, where you see these dark trees, those are steep areas. So they have to be planted with trees to stabilize the soil. Everything you see in blue trees here, which is a bit light on the screen, those are the swales. Downstream from the swale, I planted trees. And these form my different spaces within them. Other than that, so basically the people, the zone factor, my zone 1 is here because it's the largest and flattest area, so I felt it was the most appropriate for having an extended program. And out of that go the other programs. So zone 3 would be a meadow garden. It needs some maintenance because it's surrounded by trees, so it's going to be seeded with trees over time, and to keep it maintained as a meadow, it needs to be maintained and cut back. The crop gardens is zone 2, so it's in close proximity to the greenhouse. But it doesn't need as much maintenance as the vegetable gardens, which are right around the edges of the greenhouse. The orchard, same thing. The ponds are relatively habitat at the end of the day, so they're more a bit far away. This pond here, though, can be used for irrigation for the crop gardens. And basically, the parking actually is the farthest way. The parking needs the least amount of maintenance. It's a building. It's static. So it needs the least amount of maintenance, except for the roof. But the roof itself, like I said, is inspired by this command, the wildflowers. There's a lot of rare orchids on site, and there's a lot of rare gladioli and crocuses. And they want to turn this into a parking. So I decided, if I'm going to intervene and change the ecosystem here and plant trees, which is going to affect these species, I'd like to give the community as kind of ornamental garden, but not exotically ornamental, natively ornamental. So this is kind of the space where they can cultivate different wild orchids and gladioli, and it becomes this seasonal change of wild plants. And the playground is also it needs relative maintenance, so it's close to the center as well. And it's also close to the main access, which is the road here.
Thank you.
Can I answer your question?
I really like the approach of working on the ecological level and how to introduce nature to the students, because starting with children is how we actually get some development in this country. I was at St. Joseph, I'm curious to know how you're linking your project to the school and to the valley that you're talking about. You know, there's a surrounding passage where they go by and all that. It's the stitching to the context that interests me.
So just let me go back to the context.
Is it an easy access from the school to the
Yeah.
site?
So what you can see, my site here is right on the corner here. And there are 2 gates, one to the theater, which the parking is for actually, and there's a gate to the preschool. So and there is one large access gate to the park from this side. So what you see here, this large corridor connects directly to the gates, which are right here. And there are multiple gates actually. There are 3 gates to the site. So that's in terms of circulation. It's a matter of crossing the street really, because that's public domain.
Crossing the street and the vegetation reaches through, right?
Yeah. And the idea of connecting with the valley, really in between the site and the valley, there's a residential situation.
There's no place for like an ecological corridor.
Not exactly, because it's private. But the idea is by introducing this ecosystem which relates ecologically in terms of species and its diversity to the valley, I'm extending the valley into the town and creating a new niche inside the town for the valley to occupy. And maybe in the future that there could be connection around the school that can actually connect it physically.
And another part of the plan, I think the plan just requires a little bit of depth to show these ideas and shades and shadows, because you have a very exaggerated topography and a lot of things happening. I think your plan is a little bit flat related to all the ideas that you touched on. So that's the only one. Otherwise, it's very interesting. The swales, the selection of trees, and really gone into detail. Meticulously.
summer also.
Yeah.
And what about summer?
So a lot of the site is actually accessible throughout the year to the public.
Okay.
This large parking area, this playground area. The rest of the site can be managed by people that are employed to manage the site. But there's a lot of student activities, community service activities that the school engages the students in. So this can become a summer activity for the scouts as well.
It was a decision by the school, which means the school asked you to do this project.
Not exactly. I had chosen the school to focus on.
Yes.
And then when I consulted with them, they told me that this site was going to become a parking. And I really connected with the idea of parking is a bit, for something that's ecologically, it has a very high ecological value and social value at the same time. I felt like this site really spoke true, and plus it connects up to 3 different contexts.
It connects very well to the residential area, so people would really use that site. And students at school still visit the school during summer because there's a big football court and
That's
there's
true.
a lot of activities happening.
But this is, we can find this problem everywhere in Lebanon because land are private. Few are public, but the most of them are private. So try every time to find a good project to keep clean area.
It basically becomes a prototype where how other municipalities can take these small bits of land and just maximize and enhance the whole
And they can
town.
regenerate the surrounding area.
Exactly.
And I think the notion of institution also helps because the large pieces of land are heavily owned by the institution. That's why I wanted to ask.
Exactly.
There's a lot owned by the.
In the valley, the thing is they don't reveal this information. So it's hard to tell, but technically,
Develop them,
you know.
into like an ecological.
Exactly.
And still is providing in the number of cars they want to recreate.
Yes, I didn't go into that, but yeah, basically I stacked the parking and I was able to, the parking comes out of the slope and its sides are exposed, which can be trellised off to shade the parking, but also with 4 floors, one underneath the ground, I was able to accommodate
I think
300
you
cars.
had a section.
Yes, I do. So you can see here there are
Yes.
3 floors above ground, 1 below ground, which anyway would be the foundation, and it accommodates just enough cars that the school needs, which is actually really good.
Is the area high, watershed, is it high enough to build all these wetlands as well?
So yeah, so the pond, the thing is because it was a quarry, so it's down to the bedrock. So and the site is actually, like I mentioned, there's a spring here at the end. So there is water there, and the swales themselves would help with the groundwater, elevate the groundwater. And the ponds would be easy to construct because it's down to the bedrock, so there isn't much digging to do.
And there's the surrounding samples of water filtering
Not in,
plants.
not in the area, but there is. It's high enough. It's around 600, 700 meters of elevation, so there's no reason why it's
So
not too high.
that's the only area where you would be introducing species for phytoorganization. and
Exactly.
filtering.
Exactly.
Otherwise, you're using the native
Exactly.
vegetation.
Like citron, I suppose.
But we do have along the swales. I would plant nitrogen fixing trees, and we do have a lot of native nitrogen fixing trees. And the narcissus, a lot of alders, and they all work perfectly here.
The most are evergreen.
Yes,
So,
because it relates to the valley.
uh,